I work for the State Chamber of Commerce. We're a statewide business trade association. We've been around for almost 110 years. And our principal purpose is to bring the views of the Minnesota business community to the state government, to the legislature, to the governor, to the state's executive agencies. I've worked for the chamber now for over 25 years, and that state government is pretty much our focus. Local chambers of commerce, like the one here in Maple Grove, they tend to work on local government, county issues. They leave the state issues to us. Federal issues, so what the folks do in Washington, that's pretty much the work of the United States Chamber of Commerce. So in the 25 years that I've worked for the Minnesota Chamber, we've worked on exactly 2 federal issues. We spent a lot of time working on health care with, frankly, not much success. And then the second issue is the question of immigration reform and how to take what is the current immigration system and kind of bring it into the 21st century. The immigration system that we have in the U.S. today is really a function of a law that passed in 1986. That's, 30 years ago. And it really hasn't been tuned up or changed very much since then. And just think back of how much this country and the world economy has changed since 1986. And you kind of scratch your head and wonder, well, why hasn't the Congress and the president figured out how to bring that law into the 21st century? The reality is they haven't. And actually in 1986, and then I'll kind of talk about the present, when they reformed the nation's immigration laws, it's a great lesson in how political systems are supposed to work, because if you remember, in 1986, who was the president? Reagan, a Republican. Anybody remember who the Speaker of the House of Representatives was? Tip O'Neill, a longtime Massachusetts liberal, a Democrat. But, President Reagan and Tip O'Neill, they got together and they said, well, this system hasn't been fixed in I don't know how long, and we got to have a functioning immigration system. So they got together, and as a professor I once had would say, they made a deal. And, it wasn't perfect. And if they were alive today, they would acknowledge, that it wasn't, perfect, but they improved the system. And my guess is that they never would have thought or said that that should be the last time we tune up the immigration system in this country. And my guess is they would have said, how could you wait 30 years? Just like I said, think about all those economic changes. So we, as a state policy organization, because of the consequence of the immigration system to this state's economy, have taken an interest in what is a federal issue. And we don't work on it alone. We've created a thing called the Minnesota Business Immigration Coalition, which consists of the State Chamber, the Minnesota Agri-Growth Council. That's a group of not only farmers, but also food processors, people like Hormel, for example. The Hospitality Minnesota, so that's our state's hotel, motel, restaurant association. The Nursery and Landscape Association, the Minnesota Milk Producers, and the Midwest Food Processors. So it's about 6 trade associations who've come together to work toward comprehensive immigration reform. And so people say, well, why are you interested? And this goes back to President Clinton and when he was campaigning for office. For us, it's purely an economic issue. And what I want to show you are the contributions that new Americans make to this state's economy. And I think you'll see why we are, as a state trade association, are spending so much time on what is clearly a federal issue. And I'll be the first to admit that somebody else could stand up here and talk to you about the importance of immigration reform from other perspectives. You know, you could talk about it just from a humanitarian perspective. But I'm the guy from the Chamber of Commerce, so I'm going to talk about the one thing I know about, which is the economy and the economic point of view. But like I said, there are other ways to make a case for reform. But let me stick with what I think I understand, which is the state's economy. So, and I want to talk about the contributions of immigrants from 4 perspectives. I think the one that we typically think about the most is the role of immigrants, new Americans, as workers. And frankly, when our coalition started working on this issue in 2008, we thought, well, yeah, these folks are workers. That's what they do. But as we kind of worked on the issue, we came to learn that immigrants also contribute to this state's economy as entrepreneurs, as consumers, and then kind of as a bridge to the world economy. So I want to kind of take 4 passes at the role of new Americans in Minnesota's economy. And I think the most important thing that we've learned is that last point, which is that this population, these new Americans, are a really important ingredient to what we think of as the development of this state's economy. And unless this state's economy develops or changes, it doesn't grow. And I hope you'll see by the time I'm done that immigrants are really key to that equation and to getting an economy that's vital and growing. So first, let's talk about workers. Just to put everything in perspective, there are a little under 500,000 new Americans in Minnesota. They're about 8% of the state's population and close to 9% of the workforce. And so they're a little bit overrepresented in the workforce. And I think if we look 10 years out, my guess is that immigrants will become a bigger, more disproportionate representatives in the workforce. And I'll show you why I think that in a minute, but that's me speculating. Importantly, they pay about a little over $3 billion a year in taxes to state and local governments, and they're paying these taxes whether they are here legally or unauthorized. Of that 437,000, best guess is about 80,000, maybe 90,000 are here without authorization, meaning they don't have a green card, they overstayed a visa, or they came across the border without authorization. Retail spending, they shop to the tune of about $9 billion a year. And there are about 16,000 immigrant entrepreneurs in our state. So that's kind of the broad lay of the land, but let's focus on the role as workers. This is what I like to think of as the good news, bad news chart. And this comes out of a report on the role of immigrants in the economy that the University of Minnesota finished in January of 2017. And if you look at this bottom line, the one in maroon, that's Minnesota's population, the change in population absent migration. So if you just rely on the birth rate and the death rate in Minnesota, we actually lose population starting in about 2039. And if you look at this line, it stays below zero all the way out to 2070. Absent migration, we lose population. That's why from time to time you see a story in the newspaper that says when they do the 2020 census, Minnesota might go from 8 members of Congress down to 7. Because, we're not growing. That's the bad news. The blue line is the good news. If you add in people moving here, we actually grow. Now, we don't grow as fast as other states, but we actually gain population. And some people say, well, what do you make such a big deal about a gaining population? Well, again, I'm taking an economic perspective. All you have to do is look at the Japanese economy of the last 30 years. Japan went out of its way to discourage population growth. And their economy has been stagnant since then. So the reality is a growing population is key to a growing economy. Now, there are limits, obviously, but no growth is a sure ticket to economic stagnation. Okay, so migration is what helps our population grow. So let's take apart migration and look at where it's coming from. So if you look at this bar graph, this is takes us through 2013. So net migration, like the previous chart showed, is positive for Minnesota in both of those periods. More so in the most recent period, 2010 to 2013. But then look at the two columns, or the two sets of columns on the right. That far right is domestic migration. And it doesn't take a PhD to see that that the flow of people from Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, California, you pick it, is a net negative. We got all those people. They're not moving here from North Dakota and South Dakota anymore. They may have 60 years ago, but now, if anything, people are moving to North Dakota because of the opportunity, for example, in the Williston Basin to work in the oil fields, right? So if we just relied on people moving to Minnesota from elsewhere in the U.S., we'd be losing, in the most recent period, about 4,500 people in population. Then, and just I think about like my wife and I, we have 3 grown sons. So one, our oldest son and his wife and 2 grandchildren live in Kansas City. Our middle son, his wife and grandson live in San Diego. And our youngest son lives in Seattle. So we're 0 for 3. We're right here. Okay? Okay, so now look at the middle columns, the international migration. It's exactly the opposite. That's where this state gets net population growth. People moving here from, you pick it, from Latin America, from, what's that? Kenya, exactly, or Somalia, or Cambodia, Southeast Asia. Okay, so that's a net positive. The other part of this that's important is the age profile of the folks moving here from around the world. It's young and getting younger. And if you're thinking about this from an economic perspective, this is a good thing, because these are all new Americans who are just coming into the world to work. They're thinking about their career and how they're going to make a living here in Minnesota, and who they're going to work for, the business they're going to start. From an economic perspective, that's all good news. So, absent international migration, we lose people. With it, we actually grow, and we grow with folks who are, about to be great Minnesota workers and contributors to our state's economy. So just to show you how important this also comes from the University of Minnesota report. And what you see here is this top line. That's the demand for workers. The dotted blue line is the rate of growth in the workforce. So even with the international migration that we're currently getting, we don't have enough workers to keep this economy fully staffed. And actually, I think there was a report in the paper Friday that the unemployment rate in Minnesota is at an 18-year low. So the good news is we got an economy that's changing and growing. The bad news is we don't have enough workers to staff it. So we could actually use more migration from anywhere. We need people to keep this economy growing, because one of the things that businesses tell us is that the number one strength of Minnesota as a place to do business is the workforce. And as soon as businesses can't get the workers that they need in order to grow, they start thinking about growing elsewhere where they can find workers. And frankly, when they can't get those workers and they have the opportunity to grow, everything else that's wrong with the Minnesota business environment becomes that much more pronounced. They sort of wonder, well, what am I here putting up with these high taxes, or the fact that it takes forever to get a permit, when I can't get the one thing that this state really does well, which is a high quality workforce. So trying to close that gap is not only important, it's urgent. And the reason it's urgent is this is the projected rate of growth in our workforce, given current birth rate, death rate, and current migration rates. And you can see that the rate of growth in the workforce is pretty close to zero, and is going to stay that way for the foreseeable future. And our theory is that if we had a 21st century immigration system, it won't solve this problem entirely, but it will help solve the problem. And if you want, I can tell you, we have some other ideas for how you solve this workforce problem beyond immigration reform, and I can get into that if you want me to later. So a couple more things about the immigrant workers in terms of kind of what they do. This chart shows the level of educational attainment of the native-born population, that's on your right, and the immigrant population on your left. And this is important because this is what's known as a bipolar distribution. So immigrants with baccalaureate or graduate degrees, almost 15% of the immigrant population. It's only 10% of the native-born population. So immigrants are disproportionately highly educated. And then if you look at the other end of the spectrum, folks that either have a high school diploma or less, you see that immigrants, 44% of the population versus 32% of the native-born population. So this immigrant population, it's kind of two extremes. It's either highly educated or it's a high school or a GED. And I say this with a little bit of reluctance because this chart reflects the way we in the US measure educational achievement. We in this country don't always recognize the credentials that somebody may have gotten from an institution in another country. I've had the experience, maybe you have too. I get in a cab to go to the airport, and it's early in the morning. The cab driver wants to visit. I want to, what do you do? Where'd you come from? I'm from Kenya. I said, well, what did you do in Kenya? He says, I was a pediatrician. And that happens more than you would think. We don't recognize the credentials that people get elsewhere in the world. I gave a talk like this to a bunch of businesses in Detroit Lakes. And there was a woman in the audience who worked for a manufacturer, and she was an immigrant from somewhere in Africa. And so she stood up and she said, well, yeah, I'm a linguist. And she said, I speak 7 languages, and in my country I worked as a translator. So what are you doing here? Well, I'm working in this glass plant because nobody will hire me as a translator. And then she says, and I have a brother and a sister. My brother is a mechanical engineer. My sister is a pharmacist, and we're all working in the glass plant. So here's a trained pharmacist who could be doing pharmacy work. And here's I can't tell you how many Minnesota companies I talk to that tell me they need mechanical engineers. And here's a perfectly good mechanical engineer, making glass, which is a good job, but it's less than this guy was trained to do, or it's not what he was trained to do. All right, so we've got this bipolar distribution, and it's important because I visit about 100 Minnesota companies a year, and I see everything. I go to insurance companies, I go to manufacturers, I go to dairies, so I see a little bit of everything. There isn't a business that I don't visit where I don't see immigrants contributing, either on the manufacturing floor, in the front office, in the warehouse, you name it. So this actually is a Maple Grove company. This is SterilMed. Anybody know those guys? They reprocess instruments for hospitals and medical clinics. And, it's fairly detailed. I think of it as tedious work, but that's me, okay? Because part of the challenge is a hospital uses an instrument, it comes to SterilMed, they reprocess it, and then it's got to go back to the same hospital. So it's a pretty complicated process. That workforce is largely new Americans. And I like to show this slide, and then I want to show you this one too, because I think a lot of people I visit with, when they think about new Americans or immigrant workers, they think that this is the person who put the roof on my house or takes care of my parents in the nursing home. And what I want to show you is that really nothing could be further from the truth. And here statistically, 1/4 of Minnesota's computer workers, 24%, are foreign born. 23% of the folks doing work like this are foreign born. Now, it's also important to point out that half of the folks working at the Golden Plump processing plant in St. Cloud or the JBS hog processing plant in Worthington, they're foreign born too. And again, my point is that these new Americans are contributing at every level of the workforce. It's not just, putting the roof on the house or taking care of the parents in the nursing home. They're fully a part of every aspect of our state's workforce. And I think that is a really important point if you're thinking about how we help this state's economy grow. Okay, so let's go on to entrepreneurs. There are about 16,000 foreign-born entrepreneurs in Minnesota. They employ about 60,000 people. Their businesses have revenues of about $300 million. So, and the reason I show you this, and I like to talk about it, is because of this chart. So I'm going to show you the list of Minnesota's Fortune 500 companies. There are 18 of them there. Other than the fact that they're all headquartered here, what else do they have in common? Somebody guess.
Lots of immigrant workers.
They do have lots of. That's a very fair point. Good point. And somebody else. Yeah, this speaks to why having immigrants who happen to be great entrepreneurs, why it is so important to this state.
These were all started here.
Yeah, they were all started here. These are all homegrown businesses, every one of them.
By immigrants?
Actually, 40% of them were started by immigrants or their children. So, and the other thing that's important here is how many of these companies do you think were around 30 years ago in the form that they're in today?
Zero.
It's a little higher than zero.
What do you mean by in the form?
Well, look, there are 5 of them. So General Mills was General Mills 30 years ago. Target, which is on the list, 30 years ago was Dayton Hudson. They had department stores and discount stores. Today it's really a different company. It's just a discount company. The most amazing one on the list in a way is United Health Group, because 30 years ago it barely existed. And today it's the biggest publicly traded company in Minnesota. So the reason I bring this up is to stress the fact that this is a homegrown economy. More so than any state that I'm familiar with, we need entrepreneurs. We need people starting new companies because that's the way we grow. And the fact that we've got these 16,000 immigrant entrepreneurs, that's a big deal. Because those are the folks who are going to start companies that could, become part of that Fortune 500 list. And yes, please.
What is the definition of an entrepreneur? CHS?
It's an individual who starts, they might have a day job, but in the evening, they got another business in their garage or basement that they're trying to start and actually grow to the point where they quit the day job and the enterprise that they've started in their basement or garage becomes their way of life. And it may never employ more than 2 or 3 people. There are a whole bunch of successful small businesses in the state just like that, and they're every bit as important as these guys. The reality is another strength of Minnesota's economy is its diversity. The fact that we've got these huge publicly traded companies, but we also got this great population of relatively small owner-occupied businesses. Did you have a question? Am I okay? So somebody asked a minute ago, but there it is. Almost 40% of the Fortune 500s started by immigrants or their children. And there are some of the companies that don't reach the Fortune 500 level in Minnesota today that are also run by immigrants. Lifetime Fitness, for example, was started and run by a guy from the Middle East. DCare Process is a dental insurance, dental records processing company based in Eagan, I think. They process dental claims. They're sort of like what United Healthcare is, except they're just focused on dentistry and dental care. That's started and run by a guy from Ireland. So the contributions of immigrants as entrepreneurs goes well beyond the Fortune 500 list. Here's an example of Bell International Labs. This guy makes organic cosmetics in Dakota County. It was started by a guy from Iran who got a degree in chemistry from Minnesota State Mankato and worked for other companies here and then started his own business, which is now growing, quite nicely. So it continues. And don't underestimate the importance of the entrepreneurs along Lake Street in Minneapolis or University Avenue in St. Paul, or just go to Worthington in southwestern Minnesota and drive down Main Street in Worthington, or go to Wilmer and go down to downtown Wilmer. Those small cities, their downtowns, are alive again, mostly thanks to immigrant-owned businesses, insurance agencies, restaurants, grocery stores. And those businesses are as important to our community as those Fortune 500s. So the final thing I'll say about the role as entrepreneurs is, interestingly and significantly, the rate of immigrant entrepreneurship in Minnesota is substantially less than the US. So for reasons that I'm not sure I can explain, the percent of the immigrant population in Minnesota that defines themselves as entrepreneurs is less than it is nationally. I asked the state demographer why that might be the case. And her best explanation is that our immigrant population is younger than the national population. And so, 15-year-olds aren't quite ready to start a business. But give them 10 years when they're 25. But I think this is an important statistic and comparison to look at, because in a state like ours that is so dependent on entrepreneurship, when we lag the national average by that much, you got to scratch your head and wonder, well, is there something that we ought to be doing differently in Minnesota so that we could lift up that rate of entrepreneurship in our immigrant community? All right, consumer power, about $9 billion a year. When somebody moves to this country, more often than not, they're from a different culture, they've got a different language, probably a different religion, and they're just from a different place. But the piece of this country that new Americans tend to pick up the quickest is our propensity to shop, which is a great thing. Just ask the retailers in any, in a shopping mall or in some of the small towns. There's a wonderful, everybody remember Walnut Grove, Minnesota? So what's Walnut Grove's claim to fame? Little Laura Ingalls Wilder, Little House on the Prairie. If you're ever like within 10 miles of Walnut Grove, you should drive through, because there is now a restaurant, a new restaurant in downtown Walnut Grove, and it's owned by a Mung family. He is also, I think, on the city council. But one of the things that he did is he painted a mural on the side of the restaurant, and the mural is Laura Ingalls Wilder in her, prairie Minnesota outfit, I suppose, standing in front of the restaurant, next to a Hmong woman wearing a traditional Hmong costume. It's perfect. It's perfect. And the community has a restaurant, which before this guy started the restaurant, it hadn't had for 20 years. That's a big deal. And part of this, and this is where I maybe stray a little bit from the economic argument, I think the thing that's happened in places like Walnut Grove and Long Prairie and Wilmer is that Minnesotans have learned to enjoy each other's company. These folks are different, but they get to know each other and they find that there's, that the difference is actually interesting and that there's something to learn. And that's a big part of how immigrants can also contribute to this state's economy. All right, connecting Minnesota to the world. We are, in spite of what anybody says, this is a world economy. And we're not going to put that genie back in the bottle. In spite, you can build a wall or whatever you want to do. We're still, the success of this state's economy is going to depend to a great extent on our ability to do business beyond our borders. So here are some companies that have major investments in Minnesota but are headquartered elsewhere. This one, Faribault Foods in Faribault, is owned by a Mexican food producer, La Costena. They invested $150 million to rebuild their processing plant in Faribault. And they will invest another $100 million when all is said and done. If you look, JBS employs almost 3,000 people in Worthington at the pork plant there. it turns out that Golden Plump in St. Cloud, the poultry processor, is also now owned by JBS. JBS is the largest beef processor in the world. It's a Brazilian company. And the fact that its investments in the U.S. are in pork and poultry is a little bit unusual because that's not what they do elsewhere, but that's what they do here. So how does this relate to immigrants? Well, our theory is that if you're an executive from La Costana and you fly into the Twin Cities, you come to the airport, you get off the plane, you're going to go look at this business in Faribault, maybe buy it, maybe invest $150 million. You got a little time on your hands. So you say, well, I'll go to downtown Minneapolis or downtown St. Paul, see what this place is like. So you wander around. The fact that when you wander around, you see a little bit of diversity in the population, maybe you run into a few people who speak Spanish or Latinos, that makes you a lot more comfortable about writing that check for $150 million. Because you feel like there's some relationship between kind of your culture and the culture of the place where you're about to make an investment. So having a more diverse population, believe it or not, helps link us and make us more a part of that world economy. I can't put a dollar figure on this, but the steel industry, the taconite industry in Minnesota, largely foreign owned. And the example I like to use is Gerdau. Gerdau owns the steel plant on the southeast side of St. Paul. It started out in life as North Star Steel and then became Cargill Steel, and then Gerdau bought it. Gerdau is a Brazilian company. They just spent $60 million to rebuild that plant. And they're not going to do that unless they feel like, they're welcome, unless they feel welcome and a part of this state's economy. So that's the fourth piece, this kind of bridge to the world economy. We're in the 3rd congressional district, so I thought I'd share just a little bit of data about the contributions of immigrants here. You can see about 73,000 folks born outside the U.S., about 11% of the population. So relative to the state as a whole, in this part of the metro area, new Americans are disproportionately represented. Taxes, almost $1 billion a year. Retail spending, just over $2 billion. And about 1,500, almost 2,000 entrepreneurs. So pretty substantial contribution in just this congressional district. So when you take all this together, you can see that immigrants are key as workers, they're key as entrepreneurs, they're key as consumers, and they're this bridge to what is quickly becoming, more of a world economy. It is a world economy, but it's going to be more so. And finally, I'd like to close with two things. This is a case study that Professor Bruce Corey at Concordia University did of Minnesota's Hmong community. And all that he did was compare the socioeconomic status of the Hmong community in 1980, soon after they arrived here. I think they arrived in about 1974, 75. And then look how they were doing 30 years later in 2010. So you can look down at the categories, whether it's home ownership or the level of education or the median home value. It's a success story. Because the reality is, these folks want to be here and they want to be successful. And I'm pretty sure that if Professor Corey did that same case study for Minnesota's Latino population or the folks from Kenya, that you'd see the same thing. Because, like I said, fundamentally, these folks want to be here. They want to be successful. I will be the first to admit that when somebody arrives in Minnesota from a distant place where the culture is different, the language is different, their religion might be different, and they didn't always leave under, in fact, most of the times they're not leaving under the best circumstances. So when they get here, they need help. I don't dispute that at all. They need help. They need to learn English. They need help finding a place to live. They need health care. And all that costs money. But what you see here is that it's a hell of an investment. I mean, just look at the success of the Hmong community in terms of their status shortly after they arrived to 2010. And like I said, I'm pretty sure that if we looked at other immigrant populations, we'd see the same thing. And so, I'm going to stop here in a minute, but I like to show this chart. This comes from the university as well. I'm not sure you can read this, but this goes back to 1850 and goes all the way forward to 2010. So in about 1890, a third of this state's population was foreign born. A third. 1 in 3. So, and they were foreign born in Norway, Sweden, Eastern Europe. I mean, my point is that we have been here before. We've had a huge wave of immigrants, and frankly, this wave of immigrants produced lots of today's successful economy. They were entrepreneurs. And like I said, there's no reason to believe that the current wave won't be every bit as successful as the past. It's going to take a little time, but like I said, all you got to do is look at the Hmong experience. People ask me about immigration reform. So from our coalition's perspective, we kind of would do 4 things. One is we'd streamline the administration of the immigration system so that it doesn't take forever to either bring somebody here to work or to check to see if an individual is legal to work. There are all kinds of issues with this E-Verify system and the current administrative procedures. So that's first. Secondly, we would move away from a quota system, and instead we would tune the immigration into this country based on current economic conditions, so that when the economy needed more workers, we would encourage more folks to move here. And when the economy got softer, we would lower those limits. And I'm thinking here about immigration as opposed to refugees. If you want, I can say more about that's an important distinction, and I would treat refugees entirely differently. Yes, please. You need more of a dynamic immigration system that having kind of fixed quotas, given the nature of the world economy, really just doesn't work anymore. So we'd move away from quotas, move to a more dynamic system. Third, we would create a way for the 11 million people who are in this country without authorization to resolve their status, to either get to a point where they have permanent ability to work and to work like everybody else, or a path to citizenship if that's their choice. And we'd create some tests to make sure that these folks are real contributors to the community and to the workforce. But we try to resolve their status as quickly as possible. And then fourth, the secure border part. Our belief is that if you did the first 3 things, if you cleaned up the administration, if you made the system more dynamic so it related to current economic conditions, and you resolved the status of the 11 million folks that are here right now without authorization, that just doing those 3 things would make the borders more secure. And, obviously there's a debate about building a wall. This is me speaking as a lobbyist. If the price of getting those three things done was to build a wall, I'd make that deal probably. Because I think these 3 steps are far more important and meaningful, and that's politics, is making deals. So nothing is going to be quite perfect. And then finally, and I'll stop here, is that a lot of the communities that I go to have growing populations of new Americans, and we can fix the federal law at some point. I hope we will. But even after we've done that, it's really important for Minnesota communities to be more welcoming and to really embrace the diversity that new Americans bring to their community. And part of that University of Minnesota report that I've referenced a couple times suggests ways that communities can make themselves more welcoming. I think that kind of work is every bit as important as changing the law. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions or take other comments. Thank you.